In the autumn of 1942, the world held its breath as two of the most powerful armies in history fought for a city reduced to rubble and ash. In the heart of Stalingrad, the largest and most brutal battle in human history, the fate of the city, and perhaps the world, came to rest on a single, ruined apartment building. The German Sixth Army, the conquerors of Europe, threw panzers, dive bombers, and elite stormtroopers against it. Inside, a handful of Soviet soldiers, ordered to take not one step back, refused to die. The Germans waited for them to surrender. What they got instead was 59 days of hell. This is the incredible true story of Pavlov's house, a siege that became a symbol of defiance against impossible odds. If you're ready for a tale of brutal urban warfare, astonishing feats of engineering, and sheer human grit, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of the Second World War. What's the most incredible feat of military defense you've ever heard of? Let us know in the comments below. Now, to the smoking ruins of Stalingrad. September 1942. Stalingrad, Soviet Union. The city was no longer a place of life. It was a landscape of death. The German Sixth Army, the razor's edge of the Wehrmacht and arguably the most powerful single military formation on the planet, had pushed the Soviet 62nd Army to the very brink of annihilation. General Vasily Chuikov's exhausted soldiers were backed up against the wide, unforgiving Volga River, holding a sliver of the city's western bank that was, in some places, only a few hundred yards deep. Every street was a firing range. Every building a fortress, every pile of rubble a potential machine gun nest. This was not the war of sweeping tank battles the Germans had perfected. This was Rattenkrieg, the War of the Rats. A savage, close-quarters fight in a vertical battlefield of sewers, cellars, and shattered high-rises. In the center of this maelstrom, near a sprawling plaza named 9th January Square, stood four interconnected four-story apartment buildings. To the German planners looking at their maps, they were tactical objectives, buildings to be cleared and occupied. But one of these, a residential block at 61 Penzenskaya Street, possessed an immense and terrible strategic importance. From its upper floors, an observer had a commanding, unobstructed view for over a kilometer in three directions. It dominated the square, a critical assembly point for German assaults. Most importantly, it looked directly down upon the main ferry landing on the Volga. This landing was the last artery pumping blood into the 62nd Army, the only route for ammunition, food, and fresh reinforcements to cross the river. For the Germans, taking this building meant they could place artillery observers on its roof and sever that artery, bleeding Chuikov's army dry. For the Soviets, holding it was a matter of life and death for the entire city. On the night of September 27th, the building was in German hands. A platoon from the Soviet 42nd Guards Rifle Regiment was given the order to seize it. The assault was a brutal affair, a room-by-room fight with grenades and submachine guns. Of the 30 men who attacked, only 4 survived the initial fight. Their lieutenant killed, their senior sergeants all wounded. Command fell to the last remaining non-commissioned officer, a 25-year-old junior sergeant named Yakov Pavlov. Pavlov was not a product of a prestigious military academy. He was a farmer, a quiet, unassuming man who had been conscripted into the army. But in the crucible of Stalingrad, he possessed the two qualities that mattered more than any other: an unshakable will to survive and a peasant's practical ingenuity. With his 3 remaining men, Pavlov understood that simply occupying the building was not enough. They had to turn it into a fortress, a weapon. What happened over the next few days was a miracle of military engineering, accomplished by a handful of starving, exhausted men running on pure adrenaline and revolutionary fervor. Pavlov and his soldiers began to methodically transform the civilian apartment block into a masterpiece of layered defense. Their work was not just about building walls. It was about creating an integrated system of death, designed to bleed any attacking force white before it even reached the front door. The first layer was outside the building. The Soviets crawled out at night into the no-man's land of the square, laying dense minefields and stringing barbed wire entanglements to funnel German infantry into pre-planned killing zones. The second layer was in the basement and ground floor. Pavlov's men set up their most powerful weapons here. Maxim M1910 heavy machine guns and, crucially, PTRS-41 anti-tank rifles. The long, powerful anti-tank rifles, capable of piercing the side armor of a Panzer IV, were sighted in sandbagged positions in the shattered window frames, their fields of fire interlocking to cover every approach. The third layer was on the upper floors. Pavlov's men used sledgehammers to knock holes in the interior apartment walls, creating a network of crawl spaces and firing ports. This allowed them to move from room to room and floor to floor without exposing themselves to the outside. A single sniper could fire from a third-floor window, then disappear into a hole in the floor and reappear in a different apartment a minute later, creating the illusion of multiple marksmen. The fourth and final layer was on the roof, where they established mortar positions, allowing them to drop shells directly onto German troops massing for an assault just out of sight of the machine guns below. This system was ingenious, but it was useless without a lifeline. For 2 days, Pavlov's small group fought alone, completely cut off. Then, under the cover of darkness, they accomplished their most critical engineering feat. They began digging. From the basement of the house, they clawed a communications trench, a narrow tunnel, just deep enough for a man to crawl through, stretching nearly 100 meters back to a fortified Soviet command post in a wrecked flour mill. This trench was their umbilical cord. Through it, a trickle of reinforcements, including more machine gunners and mortar crews, brought the garrison's strength up to 25 men. More importantly, it allowed for the continuous resupply of the one resource that mattered more than food or water: ammunition. The garrison was a microcosm of the Soviet Union itself, a multinational collection of Russians, Ukrainians, Georgians, Uzbeks, and Tatars. They were armed with a formidable array of weapons, perfect for this type of fighting. The PPSH-41 submachine gun, with its 71-round drum magazine, was a devastating room-clearing weapon. The PTRS-41 anti-tank rifle was the great equalizer against German armor. A two-man team could fire the 14-point PAL 5mm armor-piercing round from an upper-story window, striking the thin top armor of a Panzer and disabling its engine or killing its crew. The Germans, accustomed to their tanks being kings of the battlefield, were about to discover the unique horror of a vertical anti-tank defense. Inside the fortress, civilians were discovered huddled in the cellars. About 10 Russian civilians had been trapped when the fighting began. They now became part of the defense, tending to the wounded, helping to reload ammunition belts, and bringing the soldiers water. The house was no longer just a military position. It was a living, breathing symbol of Soviet defiance. The German Sixth Army, meanwhile, viewed the building, which they had codenamed the Lighthouse, as a minor annoyance. On their operational maps, it was just one more objective in a sector that was supposed to have been cleared weeks ago. The initial German assaults were almost casual, a textbook clearing operation. A company of infantry from the 71st Division, supported by a handful of Panzer III and IV tanks, was ordered to take the building. The German commanders expected the fight to last a few hours at most. It was a routine task for the conquerors of France and Poland. This was their fundamental, catastrophic mistake. They saw a ruined apartment building. They failed to see the sophisticated, layered fortress it had become. The first German attack began in the morning. Panzers rolled across the square, their machine guns blazing at the building's facade, while infantry advanced behind them in disciplined squads. This was the classic combined arms assault that had shattered armies across Europe. It was met with a reception from hell. As the Panzers approached, the Soviet anti-tank rifles opened up from the upper floors. A Panzer IV was hit in its engine deck and burst into flames. Another was struck in its turret, the round penetrating the thin top armor and killing the commander. The surviving tanks, suddenly vulnerable to an enemy they could not see and could not suppress, began to fall back, leaving the infantry exposed. Now it was the turn of the Maxim guns in the basement. As the German infantry hit the barbed wire, the the machine guns opened up from their sandbagged nests, their interlocking fire creating an impenetrable wall of lead. The German squads were shredded. Those who survived the machine guns were targeted by snipers from above. Mortar rounds from the roof began to fall on the follow-up waves. The attack, which was supposed to be a simple clearing operation, disintegrated into a bloody rout. The Germans retreated, leaving dozens of their dead tangled in the wire. The German commanders were stunned. The fury and coordination of the defense were completely unexpected from what they believed was a small, isolated pocket of resistance. They regrouped and attacked again that afternoon, and again the next day, and the day after that. Each attack was a carbon copy of the last, and each met the same fate. Panzers would be knocked out by the anti-tank rifles, infantry would be slaughtered by the machine guns, and the survivors would be picked off by snipers. The German doctrine of overwhelming force was being systematically bled dry by a defense that was both intelligent and utterly ruthless. The Germans tried everything. They brought up 80mm anti-aircraft guns and fired them directly into the building at point-blank range. The concrete walls crumbled, but the defenders simply moved to other rooms through their network of mouse holes. They called in Stuka dive bombers, but the planes could not hit a single building with precision, and the defenders were safe in the deep cellars. They sent in elite combat engineers with flamethrowers and satchel charges, but they were cut down in the minefields before they could get close. The building seemed to be indestructible, its defenders immortal. On General Paulus's own operational maps, which showed the capture of entire countries, Pavlov's house was soon being marked with a circle and labelled Festung, fortress. The German army, which had advanced 1,000 miles to the banks of the Volga, was being held at bay by 25 men in a single apartment building. The legend of Pavlov's house was just beginning. For the German 6th Army, the continued existence of the Soviet position at 61 Penzenskaya Street was more than a tactical problem. It was an open wound, an insult to their doctrine, their pride, and their professionalism. The initial costly failures of direct infantry assault forced a change in strategy. The German command began to treat Pavlov's house not as a building to be captured, but as a malignant tumor to be eradicated through overwhelming systematic firepower. The battle for the house transformed from a soldier's fight into an engineer's and an artillerist's problem. Elite combat pioneers, Sturmpioniere, were brought in, men who specialized in the destruction of fortified positions. They crawled through the rubble-choked square at night, attempting to place massive satchel charges against the building's foundation, only to be cut down by the defenders' carefully laid minefields or picked off by the ever-watchful snipers. The Germans escalated their bombardment to a level of intensity that was insane even by the standards of Stalingrad. Heavy 150 meters and 210mm howitzers were assigned the specific task of leveling the building. They fired day and night, their massive shells reducing entire sections of the apartment block to dust. The building was slowly pulverized, its outer walls blasted away, revealing the skeletal floors and rooms within like a grotesque dollhouse. Yet, the defense held. The building's robust, pre-war construction of reinforced concrete absorbed a tremendous amount of punishment. And when the shelling became too intense, the defenders would retreat into the deep, multi-chambered cellars, waiting out the storm before re-emerging to man their posts. The German artillery was destroying the building, but it could not kill the garrison hiding within its bowels. The battle for the square also became a showcase for the most personal and terrifying form of combat in Stalingrad, the sniper duel. Pavlov's house was the perfect sniper's roost. From its shattered windows, Soviet sharpshooters could control the entire square, making any German movement in daylight a suicidal act. They targeted officers, machine gun crews, and artillery observers with cold patience. The Germans responded by bringing in their own master snipers, and a deadly, intricate war within a war began. It was a contest of nerves, patience, and marksmanship, played out across a landscape of rubble. A German sniper would spend an entire day motionless in a pile of bricks, his scope trained on a single window, waiting for the glint of a Soviet optic. A Soviet sniper would use a dummy, a helmet on a stick to draw fire, revealing the Germans' position for a counter-sniper team. For the defenders, this was another layer of psychological pressure. A moment's carelessness, a head raised too high above a parapet, meant instant death. Life inside the fortress was a descent into a subterranean, troglodytic existence. The 25 defenders lived in a state of perpetual twilight, their world a mixture of cellar dampness and choking brick dust. Sleep was impossible, measured in snatched minutes between shell bursts. The noise was a constant, mind-numbing assault. The shriek of incoming shells, the deafening blast of explosions, the rattle of machine guns, and the groaning of the tortured building itself. The stench was overpowering, a mixture of cordite, human waste, unwashed bodies, and the sweet, cloying smell of death from the square outside. Rations were meager, passed through the communications trench at night, typically hard biscuits, a few ounces of salted fish, and water that tasted of rust and earth. Yet in this hell, a remarkable community was forged. The multinational garrison, fighting under the stoic command of Pavlov and a senior lieutenant who had been sent as reinforcement, became a single organism. They shared every scrap of food, every cigarette, every bullet. The 10 civilians living in the cellar with them became an integral part of the defense, tending to the wounded with makeshift bandages, hauling ammunition, and providing a constant human reminder of what they were fighting for. The ingenuity of the defenders was limitless. They became masters of scavenging and improvisation. They used mirrors on long sticks to peer around corners without exposing themselves. They collected German helmets and painted them with red stars to use as decoys. They rigged tripwires to grenades and flares in the rubble. Their most critical task was maintaining their weapons. The fine brick dust created by the shelling was the enemy of any mechanical device. The soldiers would spend hours in the dim candlelight of the cellar, meticulously stripping, cleaning, and oiling their machine guns and rifles, ensuring they would not jam at a critical moment. This constant, disciplined maintenance, performed under the most extreme conditions, was another reason the defense held. A German infantryman, attacking with a dust-clogged rifle, was at a severe disadvantage against a Soviet machine gun that had been perfectly maintained just hours before. The story of the house and its unbreakable defenders began to take on a life of its own. For the commander of the 62nd Army, General Chuikov, Pavlov's house was more than a tactical strongpoint. It was a powerful propaganda tool. The story of the small garrison holding out against the might of the 6th Army was a perfect symbol of the entire Stalingrad defense. It was a message to the Soviet Union and the world. This is how we will fight. We will turn every building into a fortress, every citizen into a soldier, and we will bleed the enemy for every inch of our land. Chuikov's daily reports to Moscow began to feature the house prominently. Pavlov and his men were no longer anonymous soldiers. They were becoming living legends. Their stand a source of inspiration for the thousands of other soldiers fighting equally desperate but unheralded battles in other cellars and factories along the Volga. For the Germans, the symbolism was the inverse. The house became an obsession, a monument to their impotence. The failure to take a single, ruined building gnawed at the morale of the German soldiers and the pride of their commanders. German soldiers began to speak of the building in hushed, fearful tones. Being assigned to an attack on the lighthouse was seen as a death sentence. The psychological impact was far greater than the building's tactical importance. Every day it remained in Soviet hands was a public declaration that the invincible German war machine could be fought to a standstill. It contradicted their entire military philosophy and their narrative of racial superiority. How could a handful of Untermenschen, subhumans, as Nazi propaganda labeled them, defy the finest stormtroopers of the Reich? The question had no rational answer within their worldview, and this cognitive dissonance was deeply demoralizing. The siege of Pavlov's house was a brutal, self-contained universe of attrition, but it did not exist in a vacuum. While Pavlov's men were counting bullets and repelling daily attacks, a drama of immense strategic importance was unfolding on the vast steppes outside the city. The Soviet High Command, under the direction of Marshal Georgy Zhukov, had been secretly massing over 1 million men, 1,500 tanks, and thousands of artillery pieces on the flanks of the German advance. The German Sixth Army in Stalingrad was the bait, and the ferocious Soviet defense of the city, epitomized by the stand at Pavlov's house, was the anvil. The entire purpose of the bloody attritional fighting in the city was to fix the Sixth Army in place, to bleed its strength, and to distract its attention while the hammer was being prepared. Every German soldier killed in the futile attacks on Pavlov's house was one less soldier available to defend the flanks. Every artillery shell fired at the building was one less shell available to disrupt the massive Soviet buildup. On November 19, 1942, the hammer fell. Operation Uranus was launched. 2 massive Soviet fronts smashed through the weakly held Romanian and Italian armies on the Sixth Army's flanks. The Soviet tank corps raced across the frozen steppe, meeting at the town of Kalak 4 days later and completing the encirclement. The hunters had become the hunted. The entire German Sixth Army, over 300,000 men, was now trapped in the Stalingrad pocket. For the defenders of Pavlov's house, the news trickling down through the communication trench was the first glimmer of hope in 2 months. The constant pressure on their position began to slacken. The daily German assaults ceased. The artillery fire became sporadic. The Germans attacking them were now being forced to turn around and fight for their own survival against the encroaching Soviet relief forces. On November 25th, 59 days after Sergeant Pavlov and his 3 men had first entered the building, the siege was officially lifted. Soviet counterattackers finally broke through and linked up with the garrison. The defenders of Pavlov's house had not just survived, they had won. Their mission was complete. They had held the line. The relentless daily failure to capture Pavlov's house created a crisis within the German command, forcing them to re-examine the very doctrine that had brought them to the banks of the Volga. The Blitzkrieg was a symphony of combined arms, a perfect coordination of panzers, infantry, artillery, and air power. In the open fields of France and Ukraine, it was an unstoppable force. But in the vertical, rubble-choked landscape of 9th of January Square, this symphony broke down into a cacophony of isolated, futile actions. When the panzers advanced alone, they were methodically hunted and destroyed by the anti-tank rifle teams, firing down from the upper floors of the house. The Soviet teams, under the command of Sergeant Sobgaida, had turned anti-tank warfare into a 3-dimensional science. They would wait patiently as a panzer lumbered across the square, ignoring its frontal armor, which their rifles could not penetrate. They waited until the tank presented its vulnerable side or top armor, and then they would open fire from multiple coordinated positions. For a German tank commander, the experience was a nightmare. The fatal shot could come from any direction, from any floor, from any broken window in the surrounding ruins. The tanks, designed to be the spearhead of the assault, were reduced to heavily armored coffins, unable to effectively fight an enemy that was always above them. Recognizing this, the Germans then tried to lead with their infantry, the elite Sturmgruppen, or stormtrooper squads. These were men armed for close-quarters butchery, carrying MP-40 submachine guns, bags full of stick grenades, and terrifying single-shot flamethrowers, the Flammenwerfer 41. Their mission was to cross the square, breach the building, and cleanse it with fire and explosives. The journey across the 200 yards of open ground was a near-suicidal act. They would advance in a low crouch, running from one piece of rubble to the next, while the air around them was torn apart by machine gun and sniper fire. They called this the Stalingrad Steppe. For every man who made it to the relative safety of the building's outer walls, 3 more would be cut down in the square. Those who did reach the building then had to face the next layer of Pavlov's defense. As they tried to place their satchel charges against the walls or fire their flamethrowers into the windows, grenades would rain down on them from the floors above. Mortar shells, fired from the roof, would drop with unnerving accuracy into their assault positions. Even if a handful of stormtroopers managed to blast their way inside the building, they entered a prepared killing zone. The defenders had anticipated every move. The interior was a labyrinth of barricaded doors, booby-trapped hallways, and machine gun nests positioned to fire down stairwells. The holes knocked in the walls allowed the defenders to fire on the Germans from the flank and rear as they entered a room. The fight would devolve into a frantic, close-range brawl, where the 71-round drum magazine of the Soviet PPSH-41 submachine gun gave its user a massive advantage in firepower over the German MP-40. No German assault ever managed to secure a foothold beyond the ground floor, and those who tried were invariably cut off and annihilated. The German command was caught in a tactical trap. Their tanks couldn't survive without infantry, their infantry couldn't survive without tanks, and their artillery and air power were too imprecise to destroy the garrison without killing their own advancing troops. The perfect combined arms machine had been completely short-circuited by the defenders' simple, brutal, and perfectly designed system. The Soviet defense was built upon a concept that General Chuikov called the fluffy layer defense. The strength of Pavlov's house did not begin at its concrete walls. It began 100 yards out in the square. The fields of mines, the barbed wire, and the forward-listening posts hidden in shell craters acted as a crumple zone. It was designed to absorb the initial shock and momentum of any German assault, to disorganize the attackers and to channel them into the designated kill zones of the machine guns. By the time the German infantry reached the building itself, they were no longer a cohesive, disciplined assault force. They were a scattered group of terrified survivors, their officers often dead, their morale shattered. They were then systematically destroyed by the building's main armaments. The house itself was merely the anvil. The real killing was done in the fluffy layer of the square outside. This doctrine was a direct response to the German Blitzkrieg. It was a system designed not to meet force with force, but to absorb, disorganize, and bleed an attacking force to death before it could reach its objective. The communications trench remained the single most important feature of the entire defense. It was not a safe passage. The Germans, aware of its existence, shelled its suspected path relentlessly. The tunnel, barely a yard wide and shored up with scavenged planks and furniture, would often collapse, burying the men inside. The journey through it was a terrifying, claustrophobic crawl in total darkness, sometimes through mud and freezing water. The men who made this journey every night, the ferrymen, were some of the unsung heroes of the siege. They would crawl from the flour mill, dragging sacks of ammunition, tins of dry bread, and messages from headquarters, and then crawl back with the severely wounded strapped to their backs. For the men in the house, the faint scratching sound that signaled the arrival of a friendly face in the tunnel each night was a sound of hope, a confirmation that they had not been forgotten, that they were still connected to the living world on the other side of the Volga. The garrison itself was a remarkable testament to the multinational nature of the Red Army, a fact often obscured by later propaganda. The 25 men were not all ethnic Russians. The commander of the anti-tank rifle teams, Sergeant Yakov, was Ukrainian. There were Georgians, Kazakhs, Uzbeks, and Tatars among the defenders. They were a cross-section of the vast Soviet Empire, united by a common, desperate cause. This diversity was a powerful symbol, a direct refutation of the German narrative of a war against a monolithic, subhuman Slavic race. In the cellar of Pavlov's house, men from a dozen different backgrounds, speaking a dozen different languages, fought and died together. They were commanded by Senior Lieutenant Ivan Afanasyev, a professional officer who had been sent through the trench to provide experienced leadership, though Pavlov, due to his initial heroism, remained the public face and spiritual heart of the defense. The psychological toll on the German soldiers ordered to attack the house was immense. A fatalistic dread settled over the German regiments tasked with clearing 9th January Square. The daily routine was one of grim, pointless sacrifice. A company would be ordered to prepare for an assault. The men would write their last letters home, convinced they would not survive. The assault would begin, and they would run into the same wall of fire that had killed their comrades the day before. The survivors would crawl back to their own trenches. carrying their wounded and leaving their dead behind. For what? For a pile of bricks that seemed to hold no strategic value other than the fact that the enemy refused to give it up. This psychological attrition was in many ways more damaging to the Sixth Army than the physical casualties. It destroyed their morale, their sense of superiority, and their belief that they were fighting a rational war. They were being asked to die for the sake of their commander's pride, and they knew it. This small, localized battle was a perfect microcosm of the wider Soviet strategy in Stalingrad. General Chuikov's plan was not to defeat the Sixth Army in a single decisive battle. His plan was to bleed it to death, to force it to fight for every building, every factory hall, and every sewer tunnel. He wanted to drag the German war machine into a type of fighting where its strengths were useless and its weaknesses were exposed. The defense of Pavlov's house was the ultimate embodiment of this strategy. It was a bleeding wound that the German army could not close. It consumed an entire regiment's worth of combat power, diverted precious artillery and air support, and acted as a psychological anchor, tying down the German mind as much as it tied down their troops. While the Germans were obsessing over a single apartment building, the Red Army was preparing a blow that would decide the fate of the entire war on the Eastern Front. The 59 days of hell were not just a trial for the defenders. They were a slow, agonizing process of exsanguination for the attackers.